Ray. General Wallace is doing the first argument.
Yes. Sheila Murray and her husband, Edwin Tony Murray, lived at 1405 Watauga Avenue in Johnson City, Tennessee. There in that home, they raised their 3 children, Karen, Sonia, and Michael. When asked to describe her mother to us, Sonia Henry told us that her mother was funny. She was strict. She was a good cook. She was famous for her fried chicken. But above all, she was a good mom. In 2015, Sheila Murray suffered a stroke. And as her health declined, it began to affect her independence, her ability to care for herself more and more. And the more that she was unable to care for herself, the more she relied on her children, saying to her daughter Karen, "Please take care of me." By 2019, Sheila Murray had become completely and utterly dependent on her children for not only her medications, her medical care, but for basic hygiene. And we now know that she was completely and utterly failed by the 2 people who should have cared the most. For their actions and inactions, these 2 defendants are charged with murder in the first degree, aggravated neglect of a vulnerable adult. The aggravated neglect of a vulnerable adult resulting in serious bodily injury, and the aggravated neglect of a vulnerable adult with serious physical harm. Now you have heard the law, and the judge has told you that each one of those offenses include lesser offenses. I'm not going to talk to you about those lesser included offenses because they're just that, they're lesser. And they do not fully or adequately describe what Sheila Murray suffered at the hands of her own children. They are guilty as charged. Now, when I first met with you on Monday, I told you that at the end of the trial, once you had heard all of the evidence and had received the law, the case would be put into your hands. And it would be up to you to determine if these defendants are guilty of the crimes they are accused of. I told you to assist you in making your decision, you would have 3 tools. The first tool would be the evidence. And you have now received all of the evidence that you were to use in making your decision. The second tool would be the law. And you've now received all of the law that you are to use in making your decision. I want to take some time to talk to you about those first 2 tools. In count 1, the defendants are charged with murder in the first degree in the perpetration of aggravated neglect of a vulnerable adult. The elements are that the defendants, either or both, or one for whom the defendant is criminally responsible, unlawfully killed Sheila Murray. That the killing was committed in the perpetration of, or the attempt to perpetrate, the offense of aggravated neglect of a vulnerable adult. That is, the killing was closely connected to the neglect and was not a separate, distinct, or independent event. And that the defendants intended to commit the aggravated neglect of a vulnerable adult. Now you will notice that each and every element of the crimes that Judge Rice has just read to you begin with the phrase, "that the defendants." One of the things that the state must prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt is that the two people here in the courtroom today are the people who are accused and committed these crimes. So what evidence do you have as to the identity of these defendants? We know that Sheila Murray was the mother of Karen and Michael Murray. We know that Sheila Murray lived with her husband and her two children at 1405 Watauga. In 2015, Sheila Murray had a stroke, which affected her speech and her mobility. Over the years, her condition degraded until she became bedbound. She was cared for by Karen and Michael Murray. Both of these defendants, Karen and Michael Murray, have been identified to you by the witnesses in this trial: John Shelton, Joshua Jenkins, Sonia Henry, Kathleen Morris, Tracy Romans, Agent Pritchard, and Agent Ketron. Each one of them have pointed to these defendants and identified them to you. The fact of identity is undisputed by the evidence. That the defendants unlawfully killed Sheila Murray. What do we know? That after suffering from a series of strokes and other medical conditions, Miss Sheila needed constant care from her family. She was taken care of by her daughter, Karen, and her son, Michael. On August 10th of 2019, 911 was called. The report was of a possible broken leg from a fall. Those first responders told you that this came in as what they call non-emergent, which means no lights and sirens. It was said to us, it was like, hey, my mom fell, can you just come check her out? Like it wasn't an emergency. Once the EMT and paramedics saw the condition of Miss Sheila, they saw that serious injury on her ankle, and they saw the absolutely disgusting conditions that she was being forced to endure. That non-emergent call changed immediately, and she was rushed to the hospital. And we know that despite medical intervention, Miss Sheila died. She died because of that serious injury. She died because of their severe neglect. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, this crime of murder in the first degree and the perpetration of a felony, this is not premeditated murder. This is not about two people plotting a murder. This is about two people who had a duty, who had a responsibility. And because of things like, we were busy, we were stringing beans, they chose to allow their mother to lay in her own filth. They chose to allow her back, her breast, her foot to rot until she died. That this killing was committed in the perpetration of or the attempt to perpetrate alleged neglect of a vulnerable adult. When we get to this part, what we need to look at is the elements that constitute the crime of aggravated neglect of a vulnerable adult. So what are those elements? That the defendants, either or both, were caregivers to a vulnerable adult, Sheila Murray. That the defendants, either or both, knowingly neglected Sheila Murray to adversely affect her health or welfare. And that act resulted in serious physical harm or serious bodily injury. So first and foremost, we've talked about that, the defendants. We've talked about identity. So that gets us to caregivers. The law gives us a definition of a caregiver. It's a relative, son and daughter, or a person who has a legal duty to provide care or who has assumed such duty by contract or conduct that a reasonable person would interpret as an assumption of the responsibility for a vulnerable adult. So what evidence do you have in this case of caregiving? We know that in 2019, Sheila Murray was unable to care for herself in any way. She relied on her family to help her with everything, from eating to basic hygiene. Michael Murray told Agent Pritchard that he and his sister Karen were the primary caregivers for their mother. Those were his words. He acknowledged that his mother needed constant care. And he told Agent Pritchard, and you heard that interview, what each of their responsibilities were. He told you that Karen did tasks such as giving her medications and bathing their mother, because in his words, she's the lady. He told you that he would help his sister in lifting and moving their mother from her bed to the bedside commode. Because remember, when Sonia Henry talked to you, she said the only concern that she had about her sister Karen taking care of their mother was her strength. And she told you back in 2019 that her brother Michael was a much bigger person. I believe she said he's about a third of the size he used to be. He was strong. And we know that he did help with lifting and moving Miss Sheila, because he told that to law enforcement. Michael Murray said that he would not just move her and lift her, but he would help change her. He would clean the bed. He would change the sheets. Because remember, he said when cleaning the bed and changing the sheets, a lot of times they used bleach. And he had to be careful with that because his mother had such sensitive skin. Karen Murray also told Agent Pritchard that she, along with her brother Michael and her father Tony, were responsible for Miss Sheila's care. She said, we each help her eat, use the toilet, change, and clean her. She said that her father worked outside the home. Although Michael and Karen both had jobs outside the home at different points in their life, at this point, Tony Murray, their father, was the only one working outside the home. So while he was the breadwinner, their responsibility was taking care of Sheila Murray. She said that especially when her father was gone, they were solely responsible for taking care of their mother. When he was home, the three of them would. But remember what we also know about Tony Murray. At this time, Sheila was 68 years old. Her husband was older than her. He was already in his 70s. And he had health issues of his own. Sonia Henry told us about a previous heart attack, kidney issues. And we heard that he had issues with his back, so he couldn't lift her on his own. So we know that when it came to the day-to-day care, it fell on the shoulders of Karen and Michael. When Tracy Romans did her home visits, those 14 visits between January of 2017 and March of 2019, the only caregiver that she spoke with was Karen Murray. When Miss Romans would come to visit, the person that she spoke with was Karen. And if there were any problems or concerns, Karen would report those to Tracy Roman. And we know that happened because we heard Tracy Romans going through her records where she talked about on that first visit in March of 2018, after Miss Sheila had been released from Cornerstone, that Karen Murray talked to Tracy Romans about her concerns on her mother's high blood pressure because her mother had been taken off high blood pressure medicine at Cornerstone. And that was something that then Tracy Romans checked, and they discussed medications. When it came to how to give medications, when to give medications, that information was given to Karen Murray. When it came to how to care for her, her needs, that information was given to Karen Murray. That these two defendants were caregivers to a vulnerable adult. Well, what's a vulnerable adult? That's a person 18 years of age or older who, because of an intellectual disability, physical dysfunction, is unable to fully manage the person's own resources, carry out all or a portion of the activities of daily living, or fully protect themselves against neglect, exploitation, hazardous or abusive situations without assistance. So what evidence do you have that Sheila Murray was a vulnerable adult? Well, we know this, that she had a stroke in 2015, which affected her independence. And over time, her condition declined to when she was no longer able to eat or drink on her own. She couldn't move or get up and use the toilet on her own. She couldn't even clean herself. And she had become incontinent, unable to control her bladder or bowels. She was entirely dependent on her children for her care. Sheila Murray is a textbook example of a vulnerable adult. And as she declined, she said, "Please take care of me," knowing that she needed desperately their care. That the defendants willfully and knowingly neglected a vulnerable adult. Willfully means voluntary and knowingly. So what does knowingly mean? It means a person acts knowingly with respect to the conduct, meaning they know what they're doing, they're not sleepwalking, they're not hypnotized, or to the circumstances surrounding the conduct when they're aware of the nature of the conduct or that circumstances exist. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as far as I know, none of us have mind reading abilities. So we can't tell what's in the minds of Karen and Michael Murray. So to know, to understand what they were aware of, what they knew, we have to look at their actions. We know that Karen and Michael Murray lived with their parents on Watauga. And we know that although they had had jobs outside the home at various points in their life, they lived at 1405 Watauga for the entirety of their parents' lives. No one was more aware of the challenges that Sheila Murray faced than the two people who lived with her. Karen and Michael Murray were fully aware of their mother's medical conditions. When they were interviewed by Agent Pritchard, and you heard those interviews yesterday and the day before, they spoke very plainly about their mother's medical issues and challenges. You never heard them say, "Gosh, I didn't know she needed to wear a diaper. Gosh, I didn't know that she couldn't move on her own." They knew that. And they knew that this was not a new condition. It didn't happen the day before. This is something that had been part of their lives for quite a while. They knew that their mother needed total and complete care. Remember Michael telling Agent Pritchard what her responsibilities were, what his responsibilities were. Karen Murray talking about what her responsibilities were, what Michael's responsibilities were. They knew that their mother could do nothing for herself. They knew that without their help, their mother could not eat, she could not drink, she could not move. She couldn't get up to go to that bedside commode, and she had incontinence. And they knew that. because she wore diapers, and she needed to be cleaned, in both of their words, multiple times a day. They knew that she needed to use the bedside commode multiple times a day. In March of 2019, March 7th of 2019, we know that Karen Murray reported to Tracy Romans that her mother was had urinary incontinence, and she was no longer able to tell them that she needed to go to the commode. Both of these defendants knew that because of her physical dysfunction, because of her medical challenges, she could not change her own diaper, she could not change her own sheets, she couldn't wash her own hands. And ladies and gentlemen, they knew that there was medical help available, at the very least through Tracy Romans, because both of them talked about Tracy Romans coming to the house. They both talked about the things that Tracy Romans did. They knew she was there. It's clear from the statements to Agent Pritchard that they knew something was wrong with her ankle, with Miss Sheila's ankle. They talked about her complaining of foot pain. They talked about swelling. John Shelton, Joshua Jenkins, Dr. Lawson, and Dr. Cook told you that the condition of that ankle, the condition of her whole body from the top of her head to the tip of those unclipped, bloody, dirty toenails could not have happened overnight. The bone that was protruding from her ankle was dead and blackened from long-time exposure. That bone did not pop out the evening of August 10th, 2019, like a jack-in-the-box. That bone had been exposed for a while. And as far as it being wrapped, well, what we know from the medical proof is there was dried feces in and around that wound. That huge sore on her right scapula, on the shoulder blade, that didn't develop overnight. We heard from the doctors and the paramedics about progression of bed sores. You don't have a little redness today and a 5x6 open necrotic wound in a matter of hours or days. We're talking weeks. That ulcer on her back was so advanced that it had eaten through her skin, through her fat, through her muscle, and was down to her bone. And they knew that sore was there. There is absolutely no doubt in the proof that Sheila Murray was in pain. And although she could not speak, she could scream, she could moan, and she could cry. John Shelton and Joshua Jenkins, Dr. Lawson, they hadn't spent 40 plus years with Sheila Murray. But they could tell by her tears, by her moans, that she was suffering. The people who knew her best in this world most certainly knew that she suffered. They knew the condition of their mother. How could they not know? They lived there. They didn't live anywhere else. They didn't have jobs. They were there day in and day out. They knew, and they did nothing but let her lay there in her own filth. That is willful. That is knowing neglect. The law gives us a definition of neglect, and the judge has read that to you. And it's basically the failure of a caregiver to provide care, supervision, medical services, provision of food, water, medicine, shelter, medical treatment, basic hygiene. It also includes the failure to protect. And this neglect doesn't have to be a one-time thing. It can be a series of days, weeks, months that this happens. So, evidence of neglect. John Shelton and Joshua Jenkins described to you in detail the incredible odor of the Murray home. They described to you the condition that they saw Miss Sheila in. Both of them told you about the feces and the urine that covered the bed and body of Sheila Murray. John Shelton told you about that dirty shirt covered in dried vomit and the overflowing diaper. And we know from what they observed with all their senses that day, that the feces and urine on her body and in her bed that she was laying in with all of those wounds on her body was not all fresh. It was in various stages of drying. Some of it had actually begun to mold. It had been there so long. We know from the statements of both defendants that they knew that there was issues with Miss Sheila's ankle, the swelling, the pus, supposedly wrapping it. And they knew that there were issues with her skin, that she had sensitive skin. Both of them talked about her sensitive skin and the need for fragrance-free creams. So they knew that she already had a sensitivity. Tracy Romans explained to Karen Murray the importance of keeping Sheila Murray clean and dry. She talked about, since her mother was now bedbound and unable to move on her own, they were responsible for moving her. And this is not moving her when the notion strikes us, when we're not busy with our own lives. This is moving her every couple of hours. And talked about cushioning, adding cushioning to certain pressure spots. And this had to happen or there would be skin breakdown. And without proper treatment, that skin breakdown would lead to pressure sores and bed sores. We know that these defendants were aware of this need because Karen Murray very explicitly talked to Agent Pritchard about putting towels down to try and have cushioning on the mattress because she said the mattress wasn't very cushioning on its own. We know that Michael Murray talked about how it was necessary to clean his mother, change her, clean her bed, clean her sheets. They knew that she needed to be kept clean, that she needed to be kept dry, and that she needed to be moved. But she wasn't moved by either defendant. And that's not only clear from that huge wound on her back, but all the other wounds on her body. On her elbows, on her hands, on her buttocks, on her feet. And the fact that physical therapy helps with those contractures. Dr. Cook talked about that. And they did nothing but let her draw up and lay in filth. And let's not forget her breast. The hospital intake thought that Sheila Murray had had a mastectomy because her right breast was trapped under her arm. And it was trapped under her arm for so long that part of her breast had died and became infected, oozing pus and rot. That was so severe on her breast and on that huge wound on her back that after several days in the hospital, after being cleaned up, after having treatment, when Miss Sheila's body was brought to the medical examiner's office, she still had an odor of pus and rot emanating from her body. That the neglect adversely affected Miss Sheila's health and welfare. We know that Sheila Murray had a compound fracture of her ankle. The bone was sticking out of the skin. Ladies and gentlemen, I think common sense tells us all that did not magically happen on August 10th. This wasn't as described by these defendants of, it was a little red. It had a little sore like a pimple. And then, boop, bone. No. It had been exposed for quite some time. The bone had dried and the bone had died. And inside that wound, there was signs of healing where the bones were trying to heal themselves in her skin. There was feces in and around that wound, which of course we know led to infection and sepsis. But that wasn't the only wound that she had. She had abrasions, yeast, and bed sores from the top of her head to the tips of her toes. The decubitus ulcer, the bed sore on her back, was so severe it went to the bone. And we know from the doctors that bed sores, they're hard to prevent with someone who is immobile. They can be prevented. It's hard because you have to work at it. But once they start, they can be treated. They can be cared for. And there is no reason for someone who is cared for on a daily basis, an hourly basis, by their children should have a bed sore that goes to the bone. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, that wound was on her right scapula, her shoulder blade. She laid on that wound, on that plastic mattress that was covered in urine and feces. That gaping open wound she laid on day in and day out. And of course, you have the condition of her breast that we just talked about. It is clear that Sheila Murray was in pain, that Sheila Murray suffered, and she died. The last two elements are that the act of neglect resulted in serious physical harm or serious bodily injury. And the law gives us a definition of serious physical harm. It's harm of such gravity that would require medical treatment, hospitalization, involves acute pain that is of such a length of time that it causes or results in substantial suffering, any degree of prolonged pain or suffering or prolonged incapacity. So what evidence do we have of serious physical harm? Well, we've talked about most of it already. The pressure wounds all over her body, the rot in her right breast, the compound fracture of her right ankle. When Sheila Murray was moved by medical personnel who were doing everything in their training and experience to keep her as comfortable and as stable as they could, she screamed out in pain. She had to be hospitalized for her injuries. This wasn't anything like that original 911 call led medical personnel to believe that it might be a broken leg. This was a whole different ballgame. There is no doubt that Sheila Murray was in pain, and she was in pain for quite some time. Serious bodily injury is defined for us as bodily injury that involves a substantial risk of death, protracted unconsciousness, extreme physical pain, protracted or obvious disfigurement, or protracted loss or substantial impairment of a function of a bodily member, organ, or mental faculty. So let's look at our serious bodily injury evidence. We know that Sheila Murray did not receive the basic care that she needed to survive. And we're not necessarily talking about any fancy medical stuff. We're talking about a clean diaper, a clean set of sheets, a clean bottom. Basic needs. She wasn't given medical treatment. Once her medical condition worsened with those bed sores, nobody did anything. She wasn't given medical treatment for her ankle until it was far too late, because that bone had been exposed for so long, because that bone was allowed to die and rot. Her leg was unviable, according to Dr. Cook and Dr. Lawson. If she had been in different circumstances, this would have been an amputation. She died. That's the most serious injury of them all. She died as a result of the lack of care and the neglect at the hands of her own children. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the elements of murder in the first degree and the perpetration of aggravated neglect of a vulnerable adult. The law and the evidence shows you that these defendants are guilty as charged. Count 2 is the aggravated neglect of a vulnerable adult with serious bodily injury. We have already talked about the evidence that you have as to the identity of the defendants, the fact that they were caregivers, the fact that Sheila Murray was a vulnerable adult, that they acted willfully and knowingly, that they neglected Sheila Murray, that they affected her health and welfare, and that she suffered serious bodily injury. In count 3, you see the first two elements are exactly the same. The only difference is count 3, which requires serious physical harm. And we just talked about the evidence that you have as to serious physical harm. So that's the law, that's the evidence. But we got one more tool, and that's your common sense. Your common sense, ladies and gentlemen, is important because you are the judges of the credibility of the witnesses. You decide who to believe. As the judges of the facts in this case, you can believe all a witness says, part of what a witness says, or none. That is your decision as the judges of the facts. So let's talk about what we know, what the evidence has shown us, and what truly is undisputed. There's no question Sheila Murray was neglected. There is no one in their right mind who would walk in this courtroom and tell you that Sheila Murray was well taken care of, that her needs were being met, that she was in a loving, safe environment, that she was being protected in her disability. She was neglected. That's clear. There's no question that she died from that neglect. Yes, she had health issues. She had blood clotting issues. She had bone issues. She had the stroke. She had heart, kidneys. You saw that in the medical examiner's report. But you also heard the medical examiner say that had she been given the proper care, had she been in clean, sanitary conditions, this wouldn't have happened. There's no question that these two defendants are caregivers. Period, end, stop. By their own words, they were her caregivers. Nobody has to put that down on a piece of paper. There doesn't have to be any legal documents to that effect. They were her children, and they assumed that care. And they said, we were going to care for her. Michael Murray said that they wanted to care for her in the home because you know how nursing homes are. You don't get very good care in nursing homes. And there's no question that Sheila Murray was a vulnerable adult. She is the very definition of a vulnerable adult. And there's no question that she suffered serious bodily injury and serious physical harm. The only question is, was this willful and knowing? Did these two defendants knowingly engage in the conduct that resulted in neglect? They knew that she needed to be checked on. They knew that she needed diaper changes. But we know from their own admissions on August 10th that by 5:30, 6 o'clock at night, no one had checked on Sheila Murray since the day before. Because, in Michael Murray's words, we got kind of busy. In Karen Murray's words, well, you know, you have your own life to live. They knew that she needed care. They knew what she needed. Bare, basic, minimum. They knew she needed to have her diaper changed. And they did nothing. And Sheila Murray suffered the consequences. Let's look at what they admitted to knowing. We'll start with Michael Murray because that was the interview you heard first. He admitted to Agent Pritchard that he and his sisters were the ones responsible for most of the care of their mother. He said that Karen was responsible for medications and bathing because she's the lady. He was responsible for helping Karen with lifting and moving Miss Sheila. And he said, I'd clean off the bed, change the sheets, and help get her to the bedside commode. That's when he talked about the bleach and the sensitive skin. He said that he and his sister would feed Miss Sheila, make sure she had water. He also admitted that he knew there was something wrong with that ankle. He said that his mother, she was complaining, his words, about foot pain. He told Agent Pritchard that her ankle had been wrapped by Karen. He also said there was always someone with Miss Sheila. She was never alone. In his words, she's never on her own. Despite that, despite him saying, oh, there was somebody always with her. If Dad was at work, it was either Karen or me. If I had to go do something, Karen would be with her. If Karen needed to do something, I was with her. Well, we know that's not true because he said, well, yeah, we would take her to the commode or change her once or twice a day. But we know on the day 911 was called, in his words, we hadn't gotten her up that morning. In fact, he said, we got kind of busy, direct quote, and didn't check on her that evening until about 6 p.m. When was the last time she had been gotten up? Probably the day before. She hadn't been checked on or moved in almost 24 hours. And that's what they admitted to. And in his words, we just let her lay in the bed. Michael Murray said that he knew what his mother needed. He talked about her needing to be changed, to be bathed, to be fed, to be moved. He clearly understood the needs of his mother. He knew that she needed those bed linens changed. He also expressed knowledge about those medical visits when the home health nurse would come in and past and present medical issues. This is not somebody who was clueless as to things that were going on with his mom, because remember, he'd lived with her his whole life. He talked about, I think she was diagnosed with bone density problems. He talked about issues that she had when he was 14 that put her in a wheelchair. He knew quite a bit of information about his mother's medical conditions. He knew she had a sore on her back, because that's when he started talking about the fragrance-free creams. He knew that she had a sore on her ankle. And when talking about those medical visits, he was talking about things that would happen, and he specifically talked about INR checks. And he talked about his mother's condition of lymphedema. Karen Murray agreed that she and her brother were caregivers to their mother, that they, along with their father, were responsible for Sheila's care. In her words, we would help her eat, we'd check on her when she needed to go to the bathroom, change her, and try and clean her. She also gave some pretty good detailed information about her mother's medical history, talking about after the stroke, her going to the hospital, going to Cornerstone, home health visitation. She talked about there being a bump, or in her words, a hematoma, on her mother's leg, and reaching out to home health about that injury. She admitted that she knew about pressure sores. In her words, the less she would get up, the worse the sores got. That right there tells you everything you need to know. She knew that her mother needed to be moved, and moved frequently, or she would get pressure sores. Those sores would get worse. She also knew that her mother had to be moved. They had to sit her up in bed. They had to move her on her bed, to change her diaper, to change her linens. She couldn't do it on her own. She knew the less Sheila Murray was moved, the worse those sores got. And she did nothing. She claimed that she moved her mother, and maybe at the beginning she did move her once or twice. She talked about trying to add cushioning to the bed. And that's important, ladies and gentlemen, because there has been some statements trying to lead you to believe that these defendants don't understand the common English language, that they don't understand basic care like change a diaper, give a bath. This shows you that Tracy Romans explained to Karen Murray what causes a pressure sore and how to prevent a pressure sore. And Karen Murray heard that information and put it into use, at least for a little while. We know that Tracy Romans was scheduled to come to that house every 3 months, unless needed sooner. She told us that that's how she was scheduled by the doctor's office, was every 3 months. But if there was an issue, if there was a concern, she could come sooner. And that information was conveyed to Karen Murray. Her last visit was March 4th of 2019. The next visit was to be in June. But that visit was canceled by Karen Murray. When asked about rescheduling it, she kind of hemmed and hawed around. Well, I thought they'd call me. I thought they would just do it. And then ultimately she fessed up. It just slipped my mind. I got busy taking care of my mom. It's a good place there to use our common sense. Day in and day out, you see Sheila Murray. You see her condition. You see the suffering that she's enduring. By her own statement, she said she knew her mother was in pain. But making a doctor's appointment slipped her mind. That's willful neglect. She talked about the lymphedema in her legs and knew that swelling was a problem for her mom, but said, well, I didn't check on her daily. She talked about the ankle being swollen, and she talked about there being a sore that had pus and bleeding. She said that on August 10th of 2019, when they called 911, that what prompted the 911 call was she saw bleeding. I saw her ankle was bleeding and I screamed for them to call 911. Really? Because John Shelton and Joshua Jenkins both told you there was no signs of any kind of wrapping. There was no active bleeding or fresh blood. What was there was dried. And not only was she and her bed covered in feces, but so was that ankle wound. The defendant claimed that what prompted that 911 call was they were moving Miss Sheila so they could get her cleaned up because, in her words, she had pooped herself. And it was then that she saw this weird little piece of cartilage that hadn't been there before. That jack-in-the-box bone, which we know is medically impossible. First of all, that's not how a compound fracture happens. Secondly, that didn't just happen. Now, there was about 2.5 hours between the time that they supposedly checked on Miss Sheila and the time that they called 911. But that bone does not dry and die 2 hours. And again, showing knowledge about issues with Miss Sheila's legs, knowing her medical history, she talked about how they used to go to Bristol for wound care, but they stopped going a while back. It's very clear from her interview with Agent Pritchard that she knew that her mother required constant care. Despite the fact that she knew that her mother needed help with every single facet of her life. She said, quote, sometimes just with having our own lives, we just didn't check. She was the sole person that spoke to Tracy Romans and worked with Tracy Romans. She was the one who was instructed on care and medications. One of the examples of that was the thyroid medication. We know that the December 11th visit, Miss Murray's thyroid level was elevated. It was 4.99. The high range is 4.78. In talking with the defendant, Karen Murray, about that medication, Tracy Romans found out that Karen Murray was giving her that medication with her other medications. Synthroid's different. Synthroid has to be given before breakfast and at least 30 minutes before all other medications. She gave that information to Karen Murray. That information was put into use. How do we know that? Because we know at the March 2019 visit, Miss Murray's thyroid was normal. She knew what needed to be done, and she knew why it needed to be done. And she knew if there were issues, she could call the nurse. And we know that she did that when she talked about reporting that hematoma. A hematoma which was described by Tracy Romans as a contusion on the right tibia. And Tracy Romans told you that that was pointed out to her by Karen Murray, that she looked at it to check it out to see if it could be a possible break or any kind of underlying damage. And she told you, Tracy Romans, that Karen Murray showed her a picture on her phone of what what that area looked like the day before. So she knew, if I have a concern, I can take it to the nurse, because she did that. Karen Murray admitted to seeing fungus on her mother, a situation we know existed from Dr. Lawson, from Shelton and Jenkins, as well as Dr. Cook. She said she knew her mother was losing a lot of weight. When asked about the smell in that home that was so graphically described by the first responders, she said she didn't notice the smell because she was having issues with her allergies. But she did admit that she hadn't checked on her mom that day because she was spending quality time with her dad out back stringing beans, while her mom laid alone, immobile, in urine and feces, an overflowing diaper, and a vomit-covered shirt. But they had quality time. It wasn't until 5 or 5:30, according to her, that she checked on her mother. She said that she removed her socks and cleaned her feet. And that's when this little bit of cartilage was seen. We know that's not true, because her feet were covered in feces, just like the rest of her. So let's talk about what the defendants don't want to talk about. Let's talk about what the medical personnel saw. John Shelton described to you, quote, an overpowering smell of urine at the front door. He said that odor intensified as he got closer to Miss Sheila's room. He told you that she was laying in a bed in a dirty white t-shirt that had dried vomit on it. He said one of her eyes was matted with discharge and swollen shut. She had yeast around her neck, and she was laying in feces and urine in various stages of drying and decomposition. Some of it was covered in mold. He told you about the condition of Sheila Murray's ankle. He talked about that protruding bone that had blackened and died. That's not something that happens overnight. And he told you there was no active bleeding. He told you how she screamed when they moved her. Joshua Jenkins told you that this call stands out in his mind due, quote, to the sheer amount of neglect. He said upon entry into the home, he was, quote, struck in the face with a god-awful smell of human feces and urine. As someone who has been in public service for over 20 years, been an EMT for over 10 years, a parent, he said, I know the smell of human feces, of human urine. It's different than a pet. This was human. It was clear to him when he saw Sheila Murray's ankle injury that bone was necrotic. He told you that she made moaning noises, which indicated to him that she was in pain. He described her as being covered in fecal material, not only her bed, but her body as well. And some of that fecal matter had molded. Both of them told you that. The urine was brown and crystallized. Both of them told you that although Miss Sheila couldn't speak to them, and although only one eye was open because the other was so infected it was swollen shut, she would track them as they moved around her with her one eye, showing that she was aware that they were there. Dr. Christy Lawson told you that she had a very clear memory of Sheila Murray. She said that Sheila Murray arrived at the hospital covered in feces and vomit. She said that Sheila was cleaned by medical staff because she was covered in feces, that she had to be, quote, extensively cleaned off of her body before they could fully evaluate her wounds and take photos of her injuries. She described to you the multiple wounds over a large portion of Sheila Murray's body that she observed and that were treated. She told you that that ankle wound was significantly, her words, significantly infected. She told you that the severity of Miss Sheila's condition indicate to her this is not something that happened overnight. This isn't a one-time event. This is a series, a repeat behavior of neglect. She said it was important to her that Miss Sheila was admitted to the hospital because there she could, quote, receive care and be safe. She said, quote, Miss Murray will always be in my memory because of the severity of the neglect and the compassion and emotion that I felt for her. An experienced, seasoned trauma surgeon broke down in tears in talking about what she saw, what she knew that Sheila Murray had endured. Lastly, you heard from Dr. Emily Cook, who told you that the cause of Miss Sheila's death was sepsis due to delayed treatment of the right ankle fracture with the contributory factor of decubitus ulcers, bed sores. She said that the manner of the death is homicide. And she said due to the delay in medical care and the unsanitary conditions the decedent was forced to endure in her home, her fractured right lower leg became unviable. The bones became infected, and this infection ultimately led to her death. This is evidence of neglect. She told you that, like Dr. Lawson, this was a case that was beyond the pale. Had she seen bed sores before? Yep, nothing like this. Had she seen elderly patients come in for autopsy? Yes, nothing like this. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a case of medical ignorance. Well, we just didn't know what to do with that huge gaping wound in her back. We just didn't know what to do with that bone sticking out of her leg. We just didn't know what to do with that giant patch of yeast under her neck. So, I guess we do nothing. No. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a clear-cut case of willful and knowing neglect. This is a case of the utter lack of care by the very people who should have cared the most. Her own children. Ladies and gentlemen, hold them responsible. Return the verdict that truth dictates. Return the verdict that justice demands. Find them guilty. Find Karen Murray guilty of the murder of her mother, the neglect of her murder. Find Michael Murray guilty of the murder of his mother, the neglect of his murder, because the evidence shows you that's exactly what they are.